The marketplace of Willowbrook was alive with sound, merchants calling out their wares, children darting between stalls, the clinking of coins exchanging hands. The scent of fresh bread mixed with the sharp tang of spices, a normal morning for the townsfolk. But then came the disturbance. Nathan sprinted through the narrow paths, his boots kicking up dust as he weaved between startled shoppers. Behind him, a group of heavily armed men bulldozed through the crowd, knocking over baskets and shouting threats. The catchers weren't subtle, nor were they concerned with the collateral damage they left in their wake. Nathan, however, had no intention of getting caught. He vaulted over a fruit stand, knocking oranges into the path of his pursuers. One of them, a burly man with a thick mustache, slipped, cursing as he went down. Nathan grinned but didn't slow. He cut a sharp left, disappearing behind a fabric stall and into an alleyway so narrow that only a man of his lean build could slip through. For a brief moment, he thought he had lost them. Then he heard it, the sharp snap of a net releasing from above. He barely had time to look up before thick ropes engulfed him, yanking him backward. His body slammed against the cobbled ground, knocking the breath from his lungs. The last thing he saw before darkness took over was the grinning face of Cole, the leader of the catchers, standing over him. Nathan stirred awake to the smell of damp hay and the distant creak of wooden beams. His arms and legs were bound tightly, the rough rope biting into his skin. He tested the restraints, tight, but not impossible. Experience had taught him that no knot was foolproof. The barn was dim, moonlight filtering through the cracks in the walls. He could hear voices outside. "Easiest gold we'll ever make," one man chuckled. "Man's got a reputation bigger than his bite," another added. Nathan smirked in the darkness. Let them think they had won. Footsteps approached, and the door creaked open. Cole entered, his presence filling the space with an air of smug satisfaction. He crouched beside Nathan, tapping the side of his boot with a dagger. "You're quieter than I expected," Cole mused. "I thought the great Nathan Black would be plotting his escape already." Nathan opened his eyes, his expression unreadable. "Oh, I am. Just waiting for the right moment." Cole chuckled, sheathing his blade. "Sure you are." He stood, giving the ropes a quick tug before heading back outside. Nathan listened as he left, mentally cataloging everything in the room, the stacked crates, the rusting tools, the small window near the rafters. If he could just free his hands. But first, he needed to hear more. The men sat outside, huddled around a fire, speaking freely as they cooked a haunch of meat. "The bounty's higher than I expected," one of them muttered between bites. "Whitmore must really want him." Cole nodded. "He does. Wants him delivered alive, though. No slicing off fingers for fun." The others grumbled, disappointed. "You think he's dangerous?" a younger catcher asked. Cole let out a low chuckle. "He's a slippery bastard, but he's just a man. Once you've got a man tied up, he's not much different from a hog on a spit." Nathan exhaled slowly, calculating. Lord Whitmore. That name carried weight. The man ruled these lands with an iron grip, and if he wanted Nathan personally, it meant things were far more complicated than a simple bounty. He shifted slightly, feeling the ropes against his skin. He needed to move. Needed to act. And he needed to do it before sunrise. Because once the sun rose, he wouldn't just be a prize. He'd be a dead man. The air inside the barn was thick with the scent of sweat, dirt, and old wood. Nathan remained still, his mind racing through possibilities, his muscles tensed in anticipation. He could hear the fire crackling outside, the laughter of the mercenaries who thought they had already won. They didn't know him well enough. If they did, they would never have turned their backs on him. He inhaled deeply, filling his lungs with air, and then he let it out in a sound that sent every living creature within earshot into a moment of pure, primal panic. It was a war cry, guttural and raw, carrying through the night like the wail of something that should have been long extinct. It wasn't just a scream, it was a declaration, a signal, a ghost from the past reaching out to shake the present. The men outside froze, their laughter cut short as the sound of the cry echoed through the trees beyond the barn. One of them, the youngest, nearly dropped his knife into the fire. The others weren't much better. They glanced at each other, waiting for someone to dismiss it, but no one spoke. Cole was the first to move. He stood up slowly, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off an unseen weight. "What the hell was that?" No one answered. Then, just as the silence began to settle, a second cry rang out. This one wasn't from Nathan. It came from the woods. Fear, like an invisible wave, washed over the men outside. Someone cursed under their breath. Another, more seasoned mercenary, reached for his sword, his hands trembling slightly. They all knew the stories, even if they had never believed them. "The hollowborn," one of them whispered, his voice barely audible over the crackling fire. Nathan, still tied, smirked in the darkness of the barn. Cole turned sharply, his eyes scanning the trees beyond the firelight. The hollowborn were supposed to be a myth, nothing more than stories told to frighten children into obedience. Warriors who didn't die, who didn't leave their own behind. They had vanished generations ago. But myths had a way of becoming real when it was least convenient. The mercenary closest to the barn door moved, shifting just enough for the wood to creak beneath his boot. The sound might as well have been a thunderclap in the stillness. Everyone's nerves were on edge now, their hands gripping weapons so tightly their knuckles turned white. A sound rustled in the trees. Slow. Measured. "They're circling," one of the mercenaries muttered, swallowing hard. "Enough of this," Cole snapped. "It's a bluff. He's trying to scare us." But he didn't sound as confident as he should have. Then, without warning, the barn door exploded inward. The blast of movement sent splinters flying, the firelight catching the swirl of dust and debris in the air. Nathan, though still bound, rolled swiftly away from the falling door, narrowly avoiding being crushed beneath it. The first mercenary to react swung wildly with his sword, but his strike met only air. A figure cloaked in shadows moved past him faster than his eyes could track, and then, just like that, his sword clattered to the ground. A second later, so did he, clutching a deep wound on his side. Chaos erupted. The hollowborn warriors moved with eerie precision, their forms almost blending with the darkness. They struck without hesitation, their blades flashing silver in the dim barn light. One of them, a woman with a long braid and an angular face, disarmed another mercenary in a single motion, sending him crashing against a wooden beam with a well-placed kick. Cole roared, drawing his own sword. He was a veteran, no stranger to battle, but even he could feel the shift in power. His men weren't just losing, they were being dismantled. Nathan, having used the distraction to cut the last of his ropes, stretched his sore limbs before rolling to his feet. His grin was wide and wild. "Miss me?" he asked. The woman with the braids smirked. "Not particularly." Nathan didn't take it personally. The fight wasn't over, but it was clear who was winning. The hollowborn had cut through the mercenaries with brutal efficiency. The few who remained standing were either out of breath or out of options. Cole, breathing heavily, wiped blood from a gash on his forehead. His men were either down or retreating into the woods. He was alone now, and he knew it. Nathan stepped forward, his stance relaxed but his eyes sharp. "You could have just let me go." Cole spat on the ground. "Not my style." Nathan nodded, as if he understood. Then, in a blur of motion, he lunged. Cole barely had time to react. He raised his sword, but Nathan wasn't aiming for his weapon, he was aiming for his balance. A quick sidestep, a pivot, and then Nathan swept Cole's legs out from under him. The older man hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the air from his lungs. Nathan placed a boot on Cole's chest, pressing just enough to make a point. "You lost," he said simply. Cole glared up at him, but he said nothing. The hollowborn warrior with the braid approached. "What do we do with him?" Nathan considered. He wasn't one for unnecessary bloodshed. But he also wasn't naive enough to let a man like Cole walk away unscathed. "Leave him," he decided. "Let him tell the story." Cole's jaw clenched, but he said nothing as the hollowborn warriors melted back into the shadows. Nathan gave one last look at the burning remnants of the barn before following them. The night was far from over, and he had a feeling this was just the beginning. Nathan's breath was steady, but his mind was a storm of calculations. He was free of his ropes, but that didn't mean he was safe. The battle around him was chaos, shadows and firelight clashing in a violent dance. The hollowborn moved like specters, their strikes quick and deliberate, but the mercenaries were fighting like cornered dogs. Desperate men were dangerous men. Cole was still standing, sword in hand, his stance solid despite the blood trickling down his temple. His eyes locked onto Nathan's. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The real fight was about to begin. Nathan's fingers curled around a discarded dagger, the weight familiar in his grip. He didn't charge. That would be reckless. Instead, he circled, forcing Cole to move with him. The older man was bigger, stronger, but Nathan had speed. That had always been his advantage. Cole lunged first, his blade slicing through the space where Nathan had been a fraction of a second earlier. Nathan twisted, sidestepped, and slashed upward. Cole barely blocked in time. A clash of steel. Sparks flew. Nathan smirked. Not bad for an old man. Cole grunted. Not bad for a dead man walking. The barn was now a battlefield, and it smelled like one too, sweat, blood, the smoky residue of burning wood. The hollowborn were relentless, their movements precise, their kills quick. Nathan had seen skilled fighters before, but this was something else. This was a slaughter. A hollowborn warrior, cloaked in tattered black, moved like a ghost, his curved blades flashing in and out of the light. He caught one of the mercenaries by the arm, twisted, and sent him sprawling. Another warrior, the woman with the long braid, cut through two men in a single fluid motion. Nathan ducked as a wild sword swing came too close for comfort. He retaliated instantly, driving his dagger into his attacker's side before spinning away. He didn't have time to celebrate the kill. More were coming. The mercenaries, outnumbered and outmatched, were breaking. Some turned to flee, but the hollowborn weren't interested in mercy. A man tried to run past the warrior in black, but he didn't get far before a blade found his back. Nathan wiped blood from his face, looking around. The fight was nearing its end. Only one person still stood in defiance. Cole. Cole knew he had lost. The firelight reflected in his eyes, casting a flickering glow over his weathered face. His men were dead or gone. His sword was steady, but there was no mistaking the tension in his grip. Nathan tilted his head. "You're not the type to beg, are you?" Cole exhaled sharply. "Not in my nature." The hollowborn woman stepped closer, her expression unreadable. "Then you know what happens next." Cole smirked, his lips stained red. "Yeah, I do." Then he moved. It was fast, faster than Nathan expected. A last, desperate swing meant to take someone down with him. But Nathan had been expecting something like this. He stepped forward instead of back, closing the distance. Cole's blade barely grazed his arm before Nathan drove his dagger into the man's shoulder. Cole grunted but didn't fall. His grip tightened on his sword. Nathan didn't give him another chance. He twisted the dagger, sending a shock of pain through Cole's body, and then kicked him backward. Cole crashed against a broken barrel, his weapon slipping from his fingers. He was still breathing, but the fight had left him. Nathan crouched beside him. "You got fight in you." "I respect that." Cole laughed, a rough, painful sound. "Lucky me." Nathan stood, glancing at the hollowborn. "We're done here." The woman raised an eyebrow. "Are we?" Nathan nodded. "He's not worth the trouble." She considered that, then shrugged. "Your call." Cole didn't move as they walked away. He just watched, breathing heavily, as the hollowborn melted back into the night, taking their legend with them. The night was still except for the occasional crackling of the dying fire. The barn, once a place of rough laughter and confidence, now smelled of blood and burnt wood. The bodies of mercenaries lay where they had fallen, some with weapons still clutched in stiff hands. Nathan stepped over one without a second glance. Smoke curled toward the sky, barely visible in the moonlight. A lantern had been knocked over in the chaos, its oil spilling onto the dry hay. If the fire had spread any further, the whole structure would have been a smoldering ruin by now. The hollowborn moved like shadows through the aftermath, collecting what was useful and leaving the rest. Nathan stretched, rolling his shoulders as he took in the destruction. "Well," he said to no one in particular, "that was dramatic." The woman with the braid snorted, wiping her blade clean with the sleeve of a fallen mercenary. "You started it." Nathan grinned. "I prefer to think of it as expediting the inevitable." The hollowborn leader, a man with piercing green eyes and a presence that demanded silence, stepped forward. He studied Nathan for a moment before speaking. "You're lucky." Nathan raised an eyebrow. "I get that a lot." The man didn't smile. "We don't usually intervene." Nathan shrugged. "And yet here you are." The leader glanced at the bodies, then at the bound and beaten Cole, still slumped against the broken barrel. "You called, and we answered." There was weight in those words. The hollowborn were not mercenaries. They owed no loyalty to kings or lords. They didn't fight for coin. They fought for their own. And once, long ago, Nathan had saved their leader's life. Tonight, that debt was repaid. Nathan exhaled, the tension in his shoulders finally easing. The hollowborn had vanished into legend years ago, but their existence had never been a myth. They had simply chosen to disappear. And now, for the first time in decades, they had made themselves known again. One of the younger warriors approached Nathan, offering a canteen. He took it, tilting his head in gratitude before taking a long drink. His throat was raw from the war cry, and the water was a relief. He turned back to the hollowborn leader. "What now?" The man studied him carefully. "You're free." Nathan laughed. "Freedom is a funny thing." He gestured at the bodies. "Lord Whitmore won't stop hunting me." This was just one of many attempts. The woman with the braid crossed her arms. "Then run." Nathan looked at her, considering. Tempting. The leader's expression didn't change. "Or fight." That made Nathan pause. He had spent years running. Slipping out of grasp at the last second, playing the game just long enough to stay ahead. But there were only so many roads left to take before they all started circling back. He glanced toward the horizon. The first hints of dawn were touching the sky with pale light. "If I stay," he mused, "things get interesting." The hollowborn leader gave a small nod. "Then we stay too." Nathan grinned. "Now that's a dangerous offer." The woman smirked. "For Whitmore." Nathan rolled his shoulders, the weight of a decision settling over him. He had always thought of the hollowborn as ghosts, something untouchable, something too far removed from the world to be part of it. But maybe that had been a mistake. Maybe it was time to stop running. He looked at the hollowborn warriors, their unreadable expressions, their steady hands on their weapons. Then he smiled. "All right. Let's make some trouble." The city of Ashmere never truly slept. Even in the deepest hours of the night, lights burned behind high castle windows, the streets hummed with hushed conversations, and the air carried the weight of too many secrets. At the heart of it all, towering over the rest of the city like a silent judge, was Lord Whitmore's estate, a grand fortress of stone and iron, where power was hoarded like gold. Inside, Whitmore stood by a wide window, gazing out at his city. The firelight in his study flickered across his sharp features, casting long shadows on the walls. He did not need to turn when the door behind him creaked open. He already knew who it was. A messenger entered, hesitant, his boots barely making a sound against the polished floor. He bowed his head, swallowing before he spoke. "Sir, the catcher's failed." Whitmore's expression did not change. His fingers remained lightly pressed together, his gaze still fixed on the distant skyline. The messenger hesitated. "And the hollowborn were there." That made Whitmore smile. It was not an expression of amusement, nor one of anger. It was something far worse. "Good," he said simply. The messenger shifted uncomfortably, unsure if he should say more. Lord Whitmore finally turned to face him, his gaze sharp, predatory. It was never about capturing Nathan Black. The messenger blinked, confused. But, sir. Whitmore waved a hand, silencing him. Do you think I care about one runaway? He took a slow step forward, the heavy fabric of his cloak trailing behind him. No. I wanted proof. And now I have it. He turned back to the window, watching the night sky. The hollowborns still exist. The messenger's mouth went dry. You wanted them to come for him. Whitmore nodded. I've spent years trying to confirm their survival. They've hidden well, but they made a mistake tonight. His fingers tapped absently against the arm of his chair. They revealed themselves for him. That means he is either one of them, or something close enough. He let the silence hang for a moment before continuing, his voice measured. That makes him valuable. And it makes him the perfect bait. The messenger barely dared to breathe. What do you wish to do, my lord? Whitmore's smile widened just slightly. Send word to the Black Knights. The messenger stiffened. The Black Knights. Whitmore's personal force, loyal only to him, ruthless beyond measure. They were assassins and tacticians, executioners who did not leave witnesses. They had been kept in the shadows for years, waiting for a purpose. Now, that purpose had arrived. The sun had barely risen when Nathan and the hollowborn made their way through the woods, moving swiftly and silently over the uneven terrain. There was an unspoken understanding among them. They had drawn blood, left bodies behind. That meant consequences would follow. Nathan walked beside the hollowborn leader, his pace steady, his mind running through every possible next step. Whitmore won't let this go, he said. The older warrior nodded. He won't. Nathan sighed. Which means we've got two options. Disappear again or strike first. The woman with the braid, a few steps ahead, glanced back. We're not good at disappearing. Nathan smirked. I figured. They reached a clearing, the early morning mist clinging to the ground. Nathan looked at them all, the silent warriors, the ones who had risked everything to pull him out of that barn. A part of him still couldn't believe they had come for him. He took a deep breath. We don't run, he decided. Not this time. The hollowborn leader studied him for a long moment before nodding. Then we fight. Nathan exhaled, shaking his head with a rueful smile. Well, he muttered, this is going to get interesting. Far behind them, deep within Ashmere's walls, Whitmore's plan was already in motion. And Nathan Black was about to find out that he was no longer the hunter. He was the hunted.